1313th day of the war. Volodymyr Zelensky warned the Kremlin that if Russia tries to deprive Ukraine of heat and light, then Kyiv will answer in Moscow the same, and literally in Moscow. And these threats do not look empty. The key difference from the previous years is that when Russia tried to block out in Ukraine in the late fall, there were no missiles that reached Moscow. Now these missiles are there, and the Ukrainian defense complex now produces them by 50 per month, and it is planned to reach the indicator of 200 flamingos in 30 days. And these missiles are not flying anywhere yet. It can be imagined that they are being preparing exactly in response to a large-scale attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, especially since Trump has supported the principle side by side. The head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, in the meantime, is scared of the West, saying that NATO ignores the interests of security of Moscow, and that the Kremlin's response to any aggressive actions will be immediate. As we remember, the full-scale invasion of Russia into Ukraine started with the Kremlin claiming attack on Russia, allegedly attacked an FSB base which looked like a simple village cut in the forest or even a village toilet. The threat of Lavrov is quite clear. Meanwhile, Europe has finally begun preparing to defend itself, not as much as the war of the past, but face the modern challenge. A project called Scrapping the Wall of Drones is underway to block Russian invasion. The main thing is that it does not sink in the bureaucracy. The rest is one of the first real directions to protect from Russian invasion in modern realities. Igor Strelkov agrees with Donald Trump in his assessment of the lack of Russia's successes in this war. It is noteworthy that almost for the first time, Jerkin says that you have to get out of the war. He used to prefer to say how it is necessary to strengthen, mobilize people, and fight for real. Now he writes that in the current conditions it is time to end the war. Russia, not having the opportunity to achieve any of its military goals, continues the terror tactic, shelling Ukraine's civilian objects. Last night was the longest attack in the entire war. It continued for 12 hours. There are dead and wounded. All of this was shown precisely at the closure of the UN General Assembly. The state is a terrorist and it should be stopped. More on this and other topics in today's fresh report, which you can support with your likes, comments, and subscriptions to the channel. All these actions help promote the video, and your subscriptions are especially important for YouTube algorithms. So subscribe, like, and comment. You can also support the channel financially on Patreon. The link is in the description. You can also buy an NVPN, a tool to bypass blocks, which allows you to bypass blocks. Watch YouTube at normal quality and at normal speed. Use Twitter, Instagram, call via WhatsApp or Telegram, including your relatives. In general, use the internet the way you want, not as allowed by Vladimir Putin. Also, we introduced a new product, Tomer. If you are abroad and want to use state services, MOSRU, and others instead of using abroad, buy Tomer. All via the link in the description. Buying VPNs in Russia is legal and not forbidden by the law as its use. So buy, and you will support the release of new videos on this channel. If Russia threatens with a blockout in Kyiv, let it prepare for a blockout in Moscow, said President Zelensky. According to Ukraine's president, a civilized country is different in that it does not start conflicts first and is not the aggressor. However, that does not mean that civilized countries are weak. If they threaten with a blockout, for example, the capital, they should know that Moscow will block out the Russian capital. Russia must clearly understand that civilized countries are different in that they never start first and are not the aggressor. However, that doesn't mean they are weak, emphasized Zelensky. In general, it could be assumed that it is about bluffing and empty threats, but I do not intend to believe so. Do you understand what the matter is? There is no big problem in strongly reducing the energy generation of Russia and Moscow, in particular. I don't know if you noticed or not, but the electric station is a very static and a very vulnerable goal. What I still have a feeling is that when Russian representatives say that there is an oil refinery, for example, that the Ukrainians will be led through the refinery, and I have a question. What can be led through? Well, the refinery is a massive plant in which everything is visible, and from space, not from space, you can find it on Google Maps. Everything is perfectly visible where the installations are, these initial preparations, and so on. They cannot be removed under the ground, so what can be led through? These are standing stationary objects. The same applies to the electric stations. But the fact that they are healthy and the combat units of drones are not enough to cause serious damage, the electric stations of various types are not as vulnerable as oil refineries, yes, in the form of a specific unit, where, if it gets exactly, it can be pulled out of service. Now Ukraine has its own missiles, as well as Trump's recommendation to hold on to tactics face-to-face. And as I have repeatedly emphasized, I have not yet seen the mass use of Flamingo, or rather seen only once along the Crimea as part of the combat test. The combat test showed that the missiles fly. After that, new launches I did not record. Accordingly, Flamingo lie in warehouses, accumulate. They are now released by 50 per month, if you believe Ukrainian sources, and by the end of the year they want to produce 7 missiles per day. That is, by 200 per month. Can I imagine how, after the large-scale shelling of Ukraine's energy, the next day or the day after, hundreds of flamingos in it? Intersection with hundreds of drones flying over Russian power plants easily, I do not see any obstacles to this, especially given that the Ukrainian Deep Strike Company has as much pressure as it can handle the Ukrainian warhead. Especially since the Ukrainian Deep Strike Company has as much pressure as it can handle the Ukrainian warhead, especially. The Russian armed forces also have air defense systems and exactly knows which routes missiles can fly so they aren't shot down. In short, I quite assume the threats from Zelensky are not just words and Russia can fully sense its medicine. But for Ukraine, this will be the fourth winter when the Russian Federation tries to use energy. There are protocols, there is an understanding of people to what they are preparing, there are experienced emergency services workers, and for Russia that will be new. Perhaps this is just my representation, it remains my representation, and in reality, flamingo missiles do not exist. Big Siab, in Russia I'd suggest you should at least stock up on generators until the costs don't go up. The problem is also that gasoline models are available, which are also a big problem right now. In short, keep in mind that the chance of losing Russian energy in the winter of 2025 is very high, in my view, because Russia will inevitably try to take out Ukraine's energy. The Ukrainian president also reported that the Israel Patriot system has been working in Ukraine for a month, and Ukraine will receive 2 more systems. In the fall, Zelensky also handed the US President Donald Trump a list of weapons for deployment at the moment. How much of this list will Trump accept? It's unclear. Everyone understands that Ukraine hasn't lost the war. Everyone understands that from the point of view of our independence, we specifically win, said Zelensky. Meanwhile, again in a recent interview, Nebravada said he understands that from the point of view of the war at this point in time, Ukraine is neither losing nor winning. So his position about what's happening is more or less adequate, and his threat to the Kremlin, in my view, is also very adequate. Here, it's necessary to understand that these aren't just cards on a map. This is combat work and both sides are on edge. Russia is actively trying to neutralize the consequences of the Russian breakthrough, but it continues to put new forces in that place, as I recently reported to you about several Russian Marines being deployed at once. Yesterday, several sources began to say that the boiler was closed, but later information appeared that it was not true, and everyone could be right. The boiler is not a checkpoint, there is no save point. Russia continues to put in place new forces. Here, writes Ukrainian military and military analysts. For example, a Ukrainian soldier, a so-called officer in Telegram who is skeptical about the boiler all his life, calling on unhappiness earlier in the day, yesterday posted the following. I don't know, he writes, how many boilerers are there in the Dobropillia direction, but one thing is for sure, the enemy's offensive plans for this sector are finally broken because just 1 or 2 weeks ago they thought they could pull up the resources and screw up success. Affairs that were really on the line, 50/50, no gains, no losses, despite the optimistic map image and moldy. It's unexpected these territories will be immediately cleared because a lot of resources are needed and they will most likely be held under fire control, gradually clearing every house. The main thing is that no one makes a bolt out of nowhere, and the enemy cannot restore ties between the cut-off areas and the units present, the officer wrote. Ukrainian military analyst Konstantin Mashevitz clearly complains about the encirclement and emphasizes that the situation is still quite difficult. There are no encirclements, he writes, in Dobropillia's direction, but the situation is quite difficult. Moreover, over the past several days, the enemy has adopted a number of measures aimed at resolving it. Partly they were successful, so I would suggest a number of experts and especially various types of activists and politicians, including those in power in the circles, to release a couple of them so that it doesn't feel uncomfortable later. My own opinion will most likely come out on the morning of Monday. Well, we're waiting for a detailed review from Mashevitz and Deep State to better understand what's happening in this sector. But waiting is not our topic, so let's help the drones of the 225th UAP, which are engaged in this sector right now. I think these guys don't really need representation, so here's their appeal to you. Here's a QR code for Monobank in the description. Monobank, private, PayPal, USDT, TRC20, cryptocurrency. Cryptoshakes are always welcomed, as well as everyone else in an appeal. As you can see, they speak about Sumy region because the appeal was recorded since early September. My turn for the unit is plus or minus 1 month. So now they are already fighting and successfully at the Dobropillia salient. I think you know these guys are very effective and they will become even More effective with our help. The 225th Air Force is being helped. The fundraising is small, but each contribution is part of saving the lives of Ukrainian soldiers and destroyed lives of fascists and occupiers. All the links are in the description. Let's together help drone operators stop the Russian army of fascists and occupiers. Russia is becoming a direct threat to the war with NATO countries. This time they heard from the head of the DRF Foreign Ministry from the UN Tribunal. His statement is quoted by to be, or emphasizing that even a place is indicated where Russia can start the war with one of Europe's countries. The expansion of Ukraine's military expansion closely aligns with our borders, contrary to the guarantees given by Soviet leaders. Do not advance too deep into the east. Contrary to the NATO membership requiring the OBSE responsibility to follow the principle of security indifference rather than strengthening one's own. Security due to another, without demanding dominion. Our proposals for both 2008 and 2021 have been ignored and continue to be ignored to this day. Moreover, the threat of using forces against Russia, which accuses Russia of nearly planning to attack the European Union's North Atlantic Alliance, are becoming increasingly evident. President Putin has repeatedly repelled such provocations. Russia did not have or does not have such plans, but any aggression against my country will receive decisive resistance. There should be no doubts about this. Especially among those in NATO and the European Union, who not only persuades their voters to avoid a war with Russia and forces them to stretch belts, but also openly states that preparations are being made for the attack on our Kaliningrad region and other Russian territories. Bitely emphasizes that this fragment the European capitals today must be read very carefully. In reality, Lavrov announced a war against European NATO members and even mentioned where it would begin. What is December 2021? You remember the ultimatum for NATO's return to the borders of 1997, after which there was an invasion of Ukraine. I agree or disagree, this is a convoluted but quite obvious threat. Secondly, the motivation for this threat. It seems to me that Russia is trying to preserve its threat mine when the game is off. There is simply no real means to fight NATO. The only scenario is to hope that NATO will not fight for any country as a participant. Only if that's the case can Putin decide to attack. There are no other options, so whether Russia will intervene or not depends only on NATO's decisiveness, or rather whether Putin will realize his decisiveness. If the main alliance players will give a clear signal that the reaction to the invasion won't be in form of deep concern, but by troops and full participation in the war, then Putin will never give up on that. What do we see now? It's hard to say. Separate NATO members demonstrate that they will harshly retreat from their borders, for example, Poland. Others, on the contrary, want to hope that things will go quickly. The Kremlin increases provocations day by day against European countries, monitoring to what extent Europe is ready to endure. The problem is that every action without irrecoverable response leads to Putin's growing confidence that NATO is a non-existent alliance, and when this scale of confidence refills itself to certain values, Russian forces quite possibly have a chance. I won't repeat my entire video on their dispositions right now or the motives of Putin. Take a look if you missed. The most important point is that, first and foremost, Vladimir Putin takes the attack on European countries as if there is no need to capture them. Putin doesn't need it right now. He takes it as an attempt to divert attention from Ukraine. Radical provocations fit well with this, with aircraft, drones, and so on. It's because resources within European countries are determined not by supporting Ukraine, but by supporting each other or one's own self. Well, why send Patriots to Ukraine if you have drones flying around? We'd better give each other Patriots or leave one for itself. And that's exactly what Vladimir Putin has in mind. And so, some kind of quick close-up of Riga or Tallinn, maybe in order for all the European countries to surround themselves and begin to focus on their own security. But again, this option is only possible if NATO does not provide a collective, powerful response. Such powerful collective response plans exist. They exist for Estonia, for example, and for other Baltic countries. So, the mechanics of what is supposed to happen, including the speed of troop deployment, in a month, there should be up to 500,000 troops deployed in a Russian attack, and in the first 10 days, 200, if I remember correctly. We should fresh up on the numbers, maybe we'll talk separately about it. Not about the motives and what influence it makes on Putin's decision to invade European countries, but more mechanically, what NATO plan and threats exist, and so on. I think we should talk separately about it because I often get such requests, especially since I believe people misrepresentation and always look at those who, in my opinion, don't agree with reality. In short, maybe we'll talk separately. In any case, the fact that Lavrov threatens is, I think, quite obvious. However, at the moment, these threats to me more likely look like threatening without real maps in hand. The speech of the head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MIDU, is considered for me to be an attempt to pressure illusory players of the European Union, to reduce their support for Ukraine, and to reduce their desire to actively respond to Russian actions. But at the same time, normal projects that are really dependent on the modern threat of Russia have finally started. The EU will create a wall made of drones to protect the airspace and infrastructure of the continent. About this, with a link to the Commission for Defense of the Cosmos and the Euro Commission, Andrius Kubili's Financial Times reports. Andrius Kubili's actually personally understands what is happening. We know each other, it seems to me. We talked once or twice personally. Yes, when he wasn't in that position yet, he actually understands all the threats' existence. In recent years, his words actually fit 90% of what he says, 10% doesn't fit because not everyone heard what he said. He absolutely understands the situation adequately, and apparently he pushed the EU into act adequately. Greece is obvious that our drone detection capabilities are not yet at the level it should be. An official reported after a meeting with the heads of military ministries in European countries after the invasion of Russian drones in Poland's airspace and Estonia. Brussels provides financial and industrial support to countries after citing a unified approach to creating a wall of drones, Kubilis added. In his words, the ministers insisted on creating multi-level systems including radars, acoustic reconnaissance systems, and machine guns for knocking down drones. We want our systems to be comparable, for our reconnaissance systems to be able to exchange data, for our command systems and command systems to be able to exchange information. This was very important, he said, and absolutely right. Initially, the discussion of the wall of drones concerns Russia's border states, but Kubil had stated that the project would cover entire Europe. This is a very right step and perhaps the first in the right direction. Before that, all EU measures were aimed at preparing for the war of the past. The drones wall is exactly the answer that will help European countries, especially Baltic countries, have a real chance to defend their border even beyond the Russian army. Moreover, Europeans will actively gain Ukrainian experience both in developing drones and in using them. The main thing now is that this does not sink into bureaucratic error because the hours are running, and not just the hours, but the timer is on the bomb.
Который будет выявлять российские дроны. И это очень важно, потому что дешевые беспилотники, несущие боевую часть, это основное сейчас оружие.
This is, in principle, a very effective story because it is cheaper than missiles and it can produce a lot in short terms and so on. Moreover, Russia will continue to conduct such alarming attacks. But at the same time, it seems to me that EU countries need to prepare themselves for defense from a direct ground invasion. They not only need a wall of drones, but a wall of drones. Some countries are going in this direction. There are already special training sessions for schoolchildren, including all others, on how to interact with drones. Drones are obviously a new and already established paradigm of war. And not just drones, but also drones when we talk about FPV drones. In reality, creating, for example, a drone wall like the one that Magyar is planning near the Russian border with positions for drone operators is like creating a kill zone of 5-10 kilometers. In reality, it's already 20-30 drones because FPV drones are expanding. Training personnel for this and so on is what can stop the offensive on practically any scale from the Russian side. That's why this is an important point of thought. I hope the European Union will not lose it and that it won't fall apart on paper, and that all these mechanics, the mechanics of stopping strike drones, the mechanics of stopping a potential invasion, will be applied because I've emphasized this for 3.5 years. NATO is not transmitting experience at all. That all this is using trenches and all that is, of course, great, but it has little to do with how the war is conducted now, completely under different rules, using completely different methods. Because if we are talking about a threat from Russia, it's logical to assume that Russia will use the same tactics and exercises that have been advised during the war in Ukraine. At the same time, it should be understood that Russia won't have a lot of resources if we're talking about an invasion that will happen simultaneously with the war in Ukraine. Russia will literally be allocated a military corps with drone operators in Pripyat or some kind of Rubicon. We're not talking about an unwavering column of loitering infantry attacking. We're talking about assigning a considerable number of them that haven't significantly changed the situation on the front line, which Russia can afford. Europe should be able to defend itself against this. Drones are of course the answer, and the key to solving this problem is especially that the EU country has all of Ukraine's professional experience, which it is ready to share both in creating drones, creating drone operators, and in creating equipment. The effort taken into this sector has finally been seen in the right direction. Hopefully, this has been deepened and expanded. Immediately after the terrorizing Lavrov, Russia decided to emphasize its threats with terror. Last night, a massive, extremely prolonged strike on Ukrainian territory. A huge number of civilian objects were hit. Volodymyr Zelensky emphasized and showed that this attack is terroristic. He also noted that it occurred after the UN General Assembly concluded. I, like the Ukrainian president, see an ambush in this case too, an intended message. More than 12 hours of a massive Russian attack on Ukraine, Zelensky wrote, a fierce strike, deliberate terror against ordinary cities, almost 500 drones and over 40 missiles, including Kinjals. In the morning in our sky, Russian-Iranian shots returned. The main targets of the enemy attack were Kyiv, Zaporizhia, Khmelnytsk, Sumy, Nikolaevsk, Chernihiv, and Odessa regions. As a result of a fire in the capital, the building of the Cardiology Institute was damaged. 4 people were killed in Kyiv, among which a 12-year-old girl. My condolences to all my family and loved ones. Overall, at least 40 people were injured in Ukraine, among which are children. Under fire, there were a baker's office, a car tire plant, private apartment buildings, and infrastructure facilities. All emergency services are working on the ground. This attack occurred essentially at the end of the week at the UN General Assembly. That's how Russia claims its real position. It's beneficial for Moscow to continue this war and terror until energy independence and the Shade Fleet appear. We will continue to strike in response to deprive Russia of these opportunities, ensnare them, and pressure them into diplomacy. Everyone who wants peace should support President Trump's efforts and stop any Russian import. The time for decisive actions has long come, and we expect a tough reaction from the US, Europe, the Sevens, and the 20s. It's hard to disagree with something Zelensky says, and regarding the US, Trump's positions. Again, I am accused of Trumpophilia, of course, which to me looks pretty wild, because I believed and still believe that Trump is one of the most incompetent and stupid presidents in the United States. This is an absolute monstrous president, and any other president would be far better off head of the United States, because this person has no idea, neither of international politics, nor of domestic politics, nor of institutes, nor of the economy, nor of any other. He's just a fool who brought a bunch of idiots around him. As you know and as you feel, it's time for the but. And as they say, what is said, but doesn't make sense. So, for a long time, there was and still is the opinion that tariffs on India for buying Russian oil introduced by Trump were just a simulation, an attempt to pressure Delhi into charging better conditions, while in reality, America and Trump don't care about India buying Russian oil. But the longer the time goes, the more confirmed it becomes that this is indeed the fundamental position of the US president. As Bloomberg reports, citing sources, American representatives at the talks emphasized that resolving the issue with Russia is out of the question. Resolving the issue with Russian oil is the key to reducing tariffs and concluding trade agreements. Earlier, India reminded the US that to refuse Russian oil imports, American sanctions for supplying raw oil to Iran and Venezuela must be removed. As they say, you are already trading the news. At the beginning of August, the US introduced additional tariffs of 25% on Indian oil and oil products. At the end of August, tariffs on Indian goods and services increased by up to 50%, which the Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs called an unjustified step. So, if we judge by sources, this whole mess with pressure on India to make you refuse Russian oil purchases doesn't look like empty prophecy. It's more and more similar to real pressure that could actually hit Ukraine's stockpile, which has already expired. So we can only welcome the US's efforts and express hope that at least this Trump micro-plan will be a success. At least we can see that India is actively trying to find a way out, despite all its bravado statements, and walk through a handle with Putin. So let's see what the outcome will be. Of course, there are problems with Iran and Venezuela now, and it would be much better if Iran agreed to a deal now, removed sanctions, and hit the oil market. It would be great, but unfortunately, you see, while Iran, despite the fact that its position is getting worse and worse, continues to struggle. Well, Venezuela, of course, it won't agree to any deals, but I think, unfortunately, let's say, invasion of America or Venezuela is quite likely in the foreseeable future. Unfortunately, I don't like any invasion or war, so yes, Maduro is a total pervert and keeps his population and the population of his country trapped and in an absolute slave existence, but still, I'm not fan of military invasions. We'll see what the outcome is, but we see that India is clearly nervous and the US persist and seriously persist, and as you can see, even considers it a key demand. A good sign. Igor Strelkov also reacted to Trump's recent statement about the paper tiger, meaning Russia and its lack of success on the front. What is noteworthy about his new statement is that usually Strelkov aims to start war honestly, conduct mobilization, and so on. But here, he agrees with Trump's assessment and offers another approach, one he had never considered before, insisting that the war is for the existence of Russia. Now he says that indeed we should withdraw from the war. So in his post, Igor Strelkov talks about whether Russia can still win. He read Trump's last statement, an extremely harsh one regarding Russia, in which he stated that Ukraine can win over Russia because Russia has turned out to be a paper tiger, as well as all its other epithets in our address. And I, unfortunately, cannot help but agree with him in a number of issues. Indeed, fighting against a country that has been expected to collapse in 3 days or at least 3 weeks in 3 months has been unexpected for 3.5 years. It was unexpected from a country with such huge potential, opportunities, such a large war history, such significant military traditions. In such a large army, he says about Russia. Still actively interested in the issue, will anyone someday take responsibility for entering the war with a parade and exit biathlon in the Victory Park troops? Will someone take responsibility for the adventurous, completely inadequate real operational situation of the plans that have led to serious defeats and failures and huge losses? The problem is not in the right Strelkov, but I am waiting for blood or I am trying to take revenge from someone. This is the very last thing for a person who thinks about the fate of the country. My question is exactly that: if mistakes are not made and recognized, no one will fix them. If a mistake is not a recognized mistake but considered an achievement, then people who made it deserve an award, not punishment. Apparently, this is what happens when our General Staff Chief is awarded another medal. And for what they ask? For the fact that our troops advance in separate directions at the speed of a good turtle and then surrender the same territory during enemy counterattacks. Or for the fact that we, by general assessment, have been retreating from the enemy for a year and a half due to the number of UAV specificity data. Our strikes are targeting our eastern base on the Black Sea. Where is the Chornomorsk fleet, which fully owned the sea and air over it 3.5 years ago? Where was it going? The enemy is attacking without a crew to Russia, and the fleet is unable to block this in any way. What is happening over Crimea? What happens here if strikes are hitting a neighboring region, the Perm region, and we cannot respond to it and prevent it from happening? Who will respond to all of this? One minister went on strike, let it be formal. Many generals were sent by advisors to Tatarsk, and a third, a famous commander-in-chief, still leads and gets orders. What is even happening here? If considering that fighting for 3.5 years and suffering massive losses is new normality, I don't know what kind of normality it could be. Something needs to be done, something needs to be resolved. If we can't defeat the war, should we really withdraw from it? The question is, are partners allowed? We should think of how to force partners to leave the war, to agree to it. If they are unable to force, then the question no longer comes to the military leadership. Overall, I assess the situation as extremely difficult, with a persistent tendency to deteriorate. Unfortunately, I do not consider any perspective of an immediate victory over Ukraine at all, because nothing is done to prepare for this victory, writes Strelkov. As you can see, again, I pay attention to the fact that, on my mind, if not for the first time, then, in my opinion, it once skipped somewhere. But you know how it skipped in the context of need to either mobilize and give everything to Lulia or already go out of the war. That is, it was proposed not as a real alternative, but as an emphasizing that it is necessary to mobilize very, very much and direct all efforts to the war. Yes, it is either proposed or not. Here people say with what we have, it's time to move forward. And if Strelkov, who, in spite of his Z90 and everything else, always remained bloody, and always insisted that this war is existential for Russia, that it must be won, and that it must be won at any price, and so on. If he talks about moving out of the war, then, well, these are quite interesting trends. In general, I will tell you honestly, the Last month, here is September. After the end of the Russian government, there was a risk of a summer offensive. I see in the air some kind of general feeling that, well, Russia began to fall, and I am in favor of this feeling. I understand it. Today we will have an economic report with Vladimir Milam, and I don't understand what they are going to do with the economy. They published the budget, and this budget is not real. That is, for 2026, nothing is beaten. I don't understand where they will take the money. I don't understand what they are going to do. New laws will not help this thing at all. And the same thing on the front. I see the same problems. That is, yes, Russia is still advancing, blah, 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 and all that. But again, if in dry numbers, then, well, it's not that. It's kind of the absence of a practical result. So I basically understand where this mood comes from, including in the Western press, even of Trump. But I don't like that this mood has appeared. In what sense? In this war, constantly when one country relaxes, the second one starts doing something better. So seeing what is really happening on the front, helping the brigade on the front, I can say that the Ukrainian military is very difficult on the front. The problems have not disappeared, and the shortcomings of the personnel are a large number of people who themselves leave part in the Ukrainian ranks, problems with separate parts of the front. They are prepared by defense. For example, from the same city of Kupiansk. Yes, that is, there are a lot of problems. Nothing is good on the front. Everything is very difficult, and the fact that Russia cannot break through, the fact that Russia cannot achieve any significant successes, it is not thanks to the fact that, I don't know, wonders happen, but thanks to the patience of Ukrainian defenders. So the last thing I would like is for some kind of hat-picker mood to form. At the same time, I understand that there is objective data that forms these moods. And big problems for Russia with the expanding economy and no real successes in 3.5 years of war. Of course, you look at this and think, well, these are just paper tigers, a piece of beep. But if you don't look at the numbers, but look at what's really happening, you find out that Ukrainians are being killed every day. Russian terrorist attacks are very common, city strikes where people die, Ukrainian soldiers are killed. They give their lives in this war to ensure there are no serious breakthroughs. That's why I ask everyone watching this video not to infect anyone, even though I'll be posting a video soon describing how things are bad at Zeman. Maybe I'll report an article, a rather interesting one, about the situation on the front line in Western outlets, an article, but still, please take any Russian problems into account. And take into account that Russia truly ran out of options. Not that everything's already out, but on the contrary, that the most important moment is coming, when this fascist scumbag needs to be finished off to stop the war, to stop the killings, to stop all of this. So that's a little lyrical recital. I don't know if my thought reached you or not, but it just seems important to me to say this. And now, the Ukrainian strikes. The strike drones attacked the Tangavatovo oil pumping station near the Konarsivilsk district of Chuvashia. The head of the Chubash Republic, Oleg Nikolaev, reported the station. According to him, a strike drone-based attack was carried out on the station, which did not cause significant damage, and the plant's operations have been temporarily halted. The oil-picking station is located directly within the Konar settlement, about 1,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian state border, the publication Militarny emphasizes. It's reported that the station is being attacked for the first time in a month. On the night of June 9, 2025, Ukrainian drones had already struck the oil-picking station in Tinkavatovo, which led to its shutdown. The station is part of the Kybyshev-Tikhoretsk oil pipeline, used to transport oil to the port of Novorossiysk. In Crimea, authorities are increasingly writing that there are problems with fuel and urging citizens, to just forget about not refilling it. This proposal to military and Z-volunteers seems quite strange. Here is what Guliai Tarsevastopol Razvazhiv wrote. Respected Tarsevastopol residents, he writes, the first and most important thing, please do not stock up on gasoline in the future. If you have half a tank and you realize that amount is enough for 2 or 3 days, then don't stand in line trying to fuel the tank to its full capacity. Gasoline in the city appears regular. I've talked to the refineries again. Gasoline in cans won't let go of stock to reduce artificial reserve. Now gasoline in cans is being released only through the ceiling for special equipment and organizations. The desire to focus on the future only worsens the situation. In several hours, refineries go out nearly a weekly. I know there's chats where people catch gasoline cars. I want to explain that this way you also contribute to the excitement. Petrol can be used for some refineries, but gasoline can't be sold but poured to create reserves for strategic services. Gasoline is needed from half an hour to stop fueling, but here's a request from Z Channel 13 Tactical. Regarding this interesting request, anti-crisis we earned, meme, I made a deal, we won't go anywhere. First, husband in one car, wife in another. Should be away in a line for 3 hours, or the 20-liter canister for my wife and her movement along the way is criminal. Second, I need to take the refinery to the Chenger, guys, that's a bit more than a full tank. I need to be away in a line for 3 hours 2 times. Third, by standing 3 hours in a line and buying gasoline for my own money, I can't spend money on fuel. I need 2 canisters so I don't spend more time or create lines for a week. Fourth, I need to refuel my generator. Should I flush water out of a tank? The list of logical options could last until endless, considering the different scenarios of dozens of different people. Lines exist, it's a fact. 2 to 3 hours is normal these past days. Why take such decisions? Asks Zetnik. Why? To avoid panic, because everything comes from panic. Yes, there's no real problem, there's no shortage, everything goes according to Putin's Vladimir Vladimirov plan. That's how the fight goes. Soon it'll be forbidden to discuss gasoline publicly. Again, we all know how it works. The problem will obviously expand. Ukraine has not yet ceased to hit Russian refineries. It is also not seen that Russia has learned to block Ukraine from these strikes on refineries. What does this mean? It means that oil refineries will continue to lack capacity. It means that gasoline shortages will increase. Intimidation. It means that refineries will become fewer, like the oil refineries themselves. It means that gasoline concessions will expand. This is not a seasonal situation, it is not a seasonal phenomenon. It is a systematic company in Ukraine, and it is not visible to any eye how this company can stop, except by stopping combat operations. Therefore, the problem will expand. This means that fighting will not be the real problem, because fighting is impossible, and fighting can only happen after the end of the war. This means that decisions will be made to fight those who speak of it. This cannot be said about people who post videos from gas stations on lines and are accused of something, I don't know, of unfolding a military facility. Remember, there's a wild article in the Russian criminal code. So yes, prepare. There will be no normal movement. There will be no gasoline at normal prices. This will all expand. Again, anything can happen, and it may turn out that Russia has thousands of hidden refineries and oil factories that will process all of this. Belarus will refuel and go back to gasoline, but the problem for Russia is that Ukraine is also fighting well at oil refining stations, at pipelines, and so on. Moreover, Trump has allowed fighting for friendship, for anything. So the problem won't go anywhere. The result of this problem is the end of the war. And I want to say a few words about Russia's battle for Moldova. Judging by the effort spent, Moldova is very important for Russia right now. Today, parliamentary elections are underway and the Kremlin is actively trying to break them. Remember the Matryoshka operation? Right now, it has reached unprecedented scales in Moldova, reports the agency. Kremlin botos created twice the number of fake videos for Moldova elections than for the U.S. presidential elections. Botas and the Russian network Matryoshka launched an unprecedented campaign for disinformation for the presidential elections in Moldova, the project Bokrovshchik Botas reported. Since its appearance in September 2023, the Matryoshka network has tried to influence 4 elections. The presidential elections in the U.S. in November last year, parliamentary elections in Germany in February this year, parliamentary elections in Poland in May, and parliamentary elections in Moldova held this weekend. The last campaign was massive and ran a record long term, the project reported. In total, Bokrovshka released 336 fake videos, almost double the previous record. 180 videos published before parliamentary elections in the U.S., reported the representative of Bokrovshka Botas. Here I will explain that this is not about absolute importance, as natural videos have been posted more. But about the found videos. The fact is that the found ones are twice as big, since the method did not change much and the scale of the search didn't change much, means that this is likely 2 times or at least similar to the company it was. The videos made for choice in Moldova were sent to voters inside and outside the country, as well as on an EU resident. The project was clarified. Kremlin fighters tried to make a wedge between the country's residents and the diasporas abroad. Those living in Moldova convinced the video to be negative consequences of European integration, which it will include, including the youth's cutoff for the AU. Kremlin officials tried to discredit Mayasin, her party, Solidarnosti. In the video aimed at Europeans, they reported negative consequences for the European Union from European integration relations in Moldova. According to the video, this could mean economic deterioration, influx of immigrants into the drug and weapons-busting countries. During the Matryoshka campaign, artificial intelligence was actively used, forming the images of three countries' leaders, presidents of Romania, France, and Italy. Artificial intelligence images were also used, forming the images of three countries, presidents of Romania, France, and Italy. The project noted that the company's coverage and effectiveness with most views is seen as bluff. The main struggle plan for September 28 parliamentary elections will develop between supporters of European integration, the rule of the presidential party Solidarnost, and forces aimed at Russia, a patriotic bloc led by a former president Igor Dodov. The arrival of pro-Russian forces could significantly disrupt the country's Euro integration and highlight the appearance of a state unfriendly to the Kyiv government on the western border. The effectiveness of the Kremlin bots could indicate the consequences that Moscow is giving this elections. Calling for this is also indicated by statements made by official authorities. On Monday, the president of the country, Maia Sandu, spoke with a video message accusing the Kremlin of buying 100,000 votes in Moldova and abroad for 100 million euros. Sandu also noted that hundreds of people in Moldova are being charged with provocation of indecency and fear. On Monday, Moldovan security forces conducted a series of raids into the criminal case regarding the preparation of mass protests, which were started in July. According to the state agency Moldpress, more than 250 raids were carried out, including in emissary agencies. The prosecutor's office reported the detainees of 74 people and the confiscation of weapons, ammunition, and special assets. Suspects conducted tactical training in Serbia, whose actions were coordinated by a Russian security officer, the ministry noted. It's worth noting that, as often happens, at times Russian supporters say, well, Putin also talked about Western influence and that Navanov worked for CIA. Is that different, or what is it? Well, in reality, in this situation it's very different because specific data are provided here. We know there's such practice in Russia. I personally identified companies, including the Disinformation Republic, where Russia is based. I told you about that woman I told you about. A double hanger, but also here it's interesting that Serbia's Ministry of Emergency Situations confirms the report of these fighters' training. It's hard to suspect hatred for Russia or indicate indifference toward the EU, but according to Serbia and the territory of Serbia, not far. In the city of Losnes, at one of the public facilities from July 16 to September 12, such combat tactics were indeed conducted for the 150-170 citizens of Moldova and Romania. 2 detainees are suspected of their organization. According to Serbia, in the exercises, Moldovan and Romania taught them to provide physical resistance to the Moldovans. In case of lawlessness on the day of the elections, there has been confirmation from different sources. As for the rhetoric, you see, Putin used to say any authoritarian women simulate the rhetoric of normality. As Hitler said, they're the aggressors, but that doesn't make it true. The difference between expressing certain policies is whether what they say is true or not, because from the point of view of formation of words in the proposal, and so on, authoritarian leaders are including trying to share a lot what's present in the democratic process. For example, Putin says, we have elections so we hold elections. But look, in Ukraine they are not held but we hold them. Yes, but your elections are not real, they have nothing to do with reality. So we should not look at words but at the proof. And the proof of the Russian interference, the active interference in the event in Moldova, is above and above. Well, that is, there is a lot of them. At the same time, there is some proof that somehow Europeans are trying to pull up, for example. Well, there is at least one thing. Yes, that is, this is what Pavel Durov stated. So, Pavel Durov, I have quite a lot of my questions, but as if the difference between the agitation and the difference between the already counterproductive actions is when you take people, bring them to the camp, prepare them like militants in order to screw up the police. Well, in my opinion, this is already an absolutely criminal story that the law enforcement should fight against and detain such people, because this is essentially internal terrorism, training for internal terrorism. And finally, let's go back to Russia. Restore the mobilized home, said the mother's appeal in one of the mobilized ones. On September 26, 2025, the mobilized soldier Trofimova Elena, born in 1966, applied for a one-time picket in Abakin, Chuvashia. This day was the 3rd year since her son was mobilized. The woman issued a placard titled "Give My Son Back," mobilized on September 26, 2022, 3 years at the SVO, and filed for a picket in Pergamai Square, Abakin, opposite the government building. On her social network, Alina wrote, "My picket, 210925, 3 years like a son at war, 2 years of anti-depression, hundreds of paper and electronic messages, written by everyone from the president to the latest deputy from someone else's presidential district, about as many messages received. Most personal and cynical ones from the president, officials. Well, officials spend their money. It was important for them to get rid of me. There were a bunch of departments at the government building. I was supposed to write my claims, wishes. Write anything, just get the hell out of here and don't ever come back. It was important for me to show that not everyone, not even the entire people, has given way to the authorities. We know that Putin and Stalin come and go, die or leave for the fiery West, and we, the people, remain. This is our country, whatever constitution, whoever drew it, she said in her message. Soldiers from the Moscow region, meanwhile, from the category of V and D, are being sent to the combat zone despite wounded and ill, according to their relatives. An acquaintance of Ivan's soldiers from Unit 111-34 in Nerefemensk, Moscow region, was told, carefully reported, that the head of the regiment for recovery was sending troops from the category V to the combat zone. Some soldiers have nerve breakdown and can't move their hands or feet. One soldier, despite injuries to his leg, had his muscle removed and was sent to Unit B, though he cannot move without a clasp. When the lawyer filed the complaint, she was told he was sent to another unit, despite orders from the hospital to return the soldier before examination. He was sent behind a tape. A serviceman with implants on the spine was also sent to the special military zone. Close relative was also sent to a further service in another unit by 53-year-old Sergei V with a pink liver, category D, completely unfit. The night doctor stated that his documents were lost. The lawyer received a copy of the documents at the hospital and provided the unit where he was sent. The close relative claims that night officer in Unit 111-34 refuses treatment at a military medical commission and is being discharged into the combat zone. Do not want to replenish the Russian army, do not want to become killers and fascists, or just want to save your life. Stay away from the Russian army. Spend time in the forest. If you're already there, they'll help desert you. Spend time in I Want to Live. This is a Ukrainian organization that helps ensure safety, guarantee acceptable conditions in captivity. So choose yourself, live or die. And if you choose to die, then, dear viewers, once again, I ask you to donate to drones for the 225th OSHP so that fascists and occupiers are stopped. All the links are in the description. This was Michael Nacke. Take care. Goodbye.